In 1620, while the Mayflower was in Provincetown, 18 of its men sailed in a small shallop, searching for a place to live. They came to present-day Eastham, where they were met by a group of Nauset. After a brief but violent encounter, the English left towards today's Plymouth. In 2020, we remember this first encounter. We explore its meanings for today and tomorrow.
Good evening. Welcome to our Sunset series. Tonight, we're happy to have with us Terry Gallagher. He's a Japanese-English translator. It's his profession. And he's Eastham's delegate to the Barnstable County Assembly of Delegates. Thanks for being here, Terry.
Thank you, Tom. You asked me here today to talk about the end of World War II and how that event is commemorated in Japan. And you asked me because I have spent 10 years of my adult life in Japan and 5 years in Germany, and both those countries happen to have been on the other side in World War II. The subject of how World War II began and how it ended and how all of that got sorted out is a much bigger subject than we can deal with in our couple of minutes here today. But I'd like to make one simple point. Japan, like the United States, and like most countries, I think, makes a point of celebrating, of remembering its soldiers, those who made the ultimate sacrifice. But the truth is, war claims far more civilians than it does soldiers. As for how this topic relates to the first encounter, I would say that human history is a history of violence, of us against them. While vastly different in scale, World War II and the first encounter have in common a kind of violence resulting from othering. I would like to say that humankind is past that now, but looking around us, anybody can see that that is not the case. At first, I was puzzled by your question, Tom. You asked me how the end of World War II is commemorated in Japan, and my first response was to think that it isn't really. Japan was, of course, the loser in World War II, but I did some homework, and I found that beginning in the 1960s, really, Japan had a ceremony remembering the fallen, the Sembotsusha. Now, literally that word means those who have fallen in war, but if you look in a Japanese English dictionary, you'll find that it means the war dead, specifically the fallen soldiers. In 1982, the government elevated this ceremony to an official date marked by the government. It's still not what you would call a national holiday. It's not like Memorial Day. People don't get the day off. And I think most Japanese are not aware of this date at all. So we call August 15th Victory over Japan Day, VJ Day. In fact, that was the date that the emperor gave a speech saying that the war was developing not necessarily in Japan's favor, and saying that he himself was a human being. The instrument of surrender, the actual end of the war, was not until September 2nd of that year, and so that too is marked as the end of the war against Japan, depending on who you talk to. The announcement that the Japanese government made commemorating the soldiers who fell in war is actually reminiscent to me of what we have at the beginning of every meeting of the Assembly of Delegates, where we have a moment of silence to remember our soldiers who gave their lives in war and those who are still serving in the armed forces. So you can see that in Japan, as in the United States, this is the same kind of thing. But at this time of year, first half of August, what I remember is the ordinary people who died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those two bombs killed about 200,000 people, either immediately or in the aftermath from symptoms that went on, and including radiation. To put that in perspective, the American carpet bombing of major Japanese cities in the weeks and months preceding that killed about 900,000 people. So in fact, the atomic bombings were were horrible, but the firebombing that most Americans are not even aware of was much, much worse. I'm not a scholar or an expert on these matters, but in the reading I've done in the time since you asked the question, I've learned that in modern times, in World War II, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, Iraq, civilian casualties of war far outnumber the number of soldiers who die. And I wonder, who remembers? Who prays for those ordinary people? It is true that in Japan, there are museums in Hiroshima and Nagasaki remembering the atomic bombs. It's partly because America dropped these bombs on Japan that Japan, to a great extent, portrays itself as the victim of World War II rather than as a perpetrator. And Japan's neglect of civilian victims of war in the countries that it occupied, in Korea and China, has led in more recent times to great difficulties in its relationship with those countries. But I wonder about the US decision to drop the bomb at all. It's been tradition in the United States military not to kill civilians. That's been a tradition since the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln declared something called the Lieber Code. We're not supposed to kill civilians, and I wonder how we made the decision to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I understand that the US government rationalized it by saying that dropping these bombs would prevent greater loss of life, civilian and military life, in a conventional attack on the main islands of Japan. Japan was amassing millions of troops for its own defense. But I also think Japan would have been vulnerable to a simple siege, a blockade. It still has no oil for fuel. Its dependence on imports of oil and a US blockade of those imports had been one of the causes of the World War II to begin with. No, I believe the US decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was both morally wrong and militarily unnecessary. The US had devoted enormous resources to developing the nuclear technology, and it was intent on using it. The decision had more to do with the incipient Cold War against the Soviet Union than it had to do with Japan. War is hell, and history is written by the victors. Who speaks up for the ordinary people whose lives are ended or irretrievably lost, or irretrievably altered by war? Last week on NPR, I was listening to a story of a Japanese woman who was a child in Hiroshima at the time of the bombing. She and her mother were trapped in the rubble of their house, but managed to survive. Not long after, they emigrated to the United States, and in the 1950s, her father described their experience on the show, This Is Your Life. Also invited, to their surprise, was the co-captain of the plane that dropped the atomic bomb on their city. He said that on that day, he had written in his log, "My God, what have we done?" The young girl, who was burning with a desire for revenge at the time, was moved by his emotion, and she reached out to touch his hand. After that, she devoted her life to preventing nuclear war from ever happening again. Also last week on PBS, I watched a segment where former Secretary of Defense William Perry warned that although no nuclear weapons have been used since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we are now closer to that possibility than we have ever been. In the United States, the President has the sole power and authority to decide whether to launch a nuclear attack. Thank you very much.
My name is Joanna Hollick. I'd like to share an invitation with you regarding Eastham 400's other series, the Campfire Series. The Campfire Series is a series of hour-long presentations each Sunday in July and August that delve more deeply into some of the topics that we discuss here on the Sunset Series. I am happy to share that 2 of our campfires will be held in person. On Sunday, August 16th and Sunday, August 30th, these campfires will take place at the Eastham Windmill at 6 p.m. Presentations feature John Hanlon, who has led the campfire programs at Cape Cod National Seashore for the last 20 years, and Linda Coombs of the Aquinnah Wampanoag tribe. Admission is free, but registration is required. You can sign up for these events using a form on our website, www.eastham400.org. We are looking forward to these events and hope to see you there. Thank Thank you.